In 1957, the Arkansas National Guard was called out to prevent African American children from entering Central High in Little Rock. To cover the event, NBC sent a young journalist named John Chancellor. I became a source for John Chancellor on what was happening at Central High. John Chancellor was my insurance policy, my protection against the world's injustices. Through his reporting, John Chancellor dispelled lies and ignorance. For the first time, the new age of television journalism enabled the world to see the ugliness of racial hatred. And the result was a great advance for the cause of civil rights. That's why journalism is so important today and will be in the future. It is our first line of defense against those who would subject the world to lies and ignorance. By spreading light and truth, journalists have the power and influence to make the world a better place to live in, not just for a few, but for millions or even billions. But it takes courage, character, and integrity. John Chancellor had that courage. Alissa Rubin does too. John Chancellor is my hero. He was my hero at age 16 in Little Rock. And he's still my hero because he represented the truth. When he agreed to permit us to establish the John Chancellor Award for Excellence in Journalism, he envisioned rewarding the kind of journalism that would say to successive generations, this is the sort of work to which we should dedicate our lives. Alissa Rubin's work meets that test. She has championed the principles that make society more hospitable to both tolerance and truth. Alissa, we honor the memory of John Chancellor by honoring your work. You have our admiration and gratitude for your contributions to journalism and to society. Alissa? In tribute to the life work of John Chancellor, I am pleased to present Alissa Rubin with the John Chancellor Medal for Excellence in Journalism and a check for $25,000.
Thank you all so much. I am truly overwhelmed, and really so many of the things said tonight were so kind, and I don't feel I deserve them, but I deeply appreciate that everyone came, and and spoke as they did. I could say much the same about every single person on this stage. I'm truly overwhelmed by this honor and not sure how to proceed, but I want to first thank the Chancellor family and say that I hope I have enough time left in my working life to do justice to this award and the memory of John Chancellor, who stood for what we all believe in, which is bearing witness and writing or broadcasting what you see, no matter how hard it is for people to hear it. I also want to thank Ira Lipman for his extraordinary generosity and openness to journalists, not least of all because we live in times when the press so often is seen as something either to be scorned or manipulated. And I would like to thank Columbia University for hosting this award and give a special thanks to Steve Call, whom I knew first many, many years ago. I'm not even sure if he remembers it, in Washington, D.C., when in one of his many incarnations, he was the editor of the Washington Post magazine and brilliantly edited a piece of mine that I believe was on doctors who also did religious healing that was desperately in need of his elegant and orderly thought. And I would like to thank Carolyn and Abby and Lisa, who have organized tonight and put together the guest list and managed to be sure that everybody got here and brought us all together. It's not an easy job either. And I very much want to thank the judges for reading my work and deciding to give me this award. Often lifetime awards are given posthumously. So I'm very, very glad, given the events in a helicopter on Mount Sinjar, that I could be here tonight and be able to receive it. There are many other deserving journalists who could stand here in my place, and many of them are in this room tonight. And so I consider myself extraordinarily lucky. And I should say there are many also who can't be with us, who've died, doing their work. And one came to mind particularly as people spoke about Iraq, and that is Anthony Shadid, who told the Iraq story like nobody else. Not least of all, I would like to thank my editors at the New York Times, who are led by Dean Baquet, who I've known for most of the last 15 years, and who has had the courage and curiosity to figure out how journalism can use new mediums without being compromised by them, and who also is a voracious reader who always has a book to recommend and always wants to know what you're reading. When I first heard I'd gotten this award, I had three thoughts. The first was, I hope they didn't give this to me because I was in a helicopter crash. And then, since recovering, I feel that I'm working with more focus and more energy and more excitement. I thought, well, it's way too early for a lifetime award. I still have so much work to do. You should wait until I'm much, much older. And then my third thought was, who had brought me to this point, and who should I thank for that? And as I began to make a list, I was really overwhelmed by how many extraordinary journalists I had had the enormous luck and chance to learn from. How many of my colleagues at my early jobs in Kansas and at the Congressional Quarterly and later at the Los Angeles Times and New York Times, and how many editors and photographers who have given me so much as we've journeyed to different places. But I want to say most important and too easily forgotten are the fixers and translators in foreign countries who taught me what mattered in their worlds, who protected me, and generously offered me many of the ideas that became my stories. They were Serbians and Iraqi, Shia, Sunnis, and Kurds. They are Afghans and Jordanians. They take the most risks, make many of the hardest decisions, and have the most commitment to journalism of any of us, because for them it is far more often a matter of life and death, and we owe them everything. I would like to dedicate this award to my father and mother. I am so sorry that my father cannot be here with us because more than anyone else, he taught me both the love of words, of the poetry in ordinary language, as well as in the works of the great writers. And he taught me to listen to people's stories, their dreams, regrets, their passions, and their rage. My father had a way of not judging people. Perhaps it was his profession. He was a psychiatrist. But I think more than that, he was deeply interested in what drove people to commit acts of beauty and art, but also about what led them to do terrible things. And I've tried to live with his openness to the world and not judge people first, but ask where their actions come from. When I was about 12, maybe 13, but I think 12, our family went to see a play at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, and we were coming back late on the F train, and a man boarded our subway car waving a large knife. My mother and sister and I were frightened and slid down the seat away from the man, which was probably sensible. But my father just sat there as if he was the mailman. And the guy sat down, ranting and waving the knife in front of my father. And my father nodded sympathetically as the man raved. And finally, my father said very gently, "You know, you should be careful with that. You could hurt yourself." The man was to him human and vulnerable, not some dangerous other to be avoided. I've carried that thought with me as I've talked to former henchmen for Uday Hussein, Taliban and Al-Qaeda operatives, as well as warlords who are perhaps more deadly than any of those. And it's always what makes people do what they do. That is the question for me, be it good or ill. Can we see the world enough through their eyes to make the incomprehensibly violent begin to be understood? And can we think about it analytically enough to see where governments or corporations have made mistakes? It was my father who introduced me first to the work of both Martha Gellhorn and Frances Fitzgerald, as well as getting me to read the Iliad, and all three have had a great influence on my thinking. This award is also for my mother, who is just a few days short of 90 and is here tonight. She is still curious about the world, about people, about the why of things, and fostered that in me. After crisscrossing Europe many times, she and my father began traveling to the Muslim world when they were in their 70s, visiting Tunisia, Syria, and Turkey. She embraced learning about Islam, the religion, as well as its art and literature, and her combination of intellect and heart is with me every day, along with her voracious interest in other people's lives. Two other family members that I must thank are my husband, James Costello, and my sister, Hannah Rubin. Both would rather that I not go to the places I go, but they have both supported me, and although they could have easily said, "I told you so," last year when the helicopter crashed, they did not. Thank you, James, for being there, for reading my stories, for being my toughest critic, and thank you, Hannah, for your support and love, and for your 101 story ideas. I also want to thank specifically a few people who shaped my career. The first, and took a chance on me when I had absolutely no background, had never gone to journalism school, and hadn't worked at any, college newspaper or anything of that sort. The first is Steve Brill, who was my first boss, and where I met one of my later bosses, Jill Abramson, who is a similarly incisive mind. Steve is a unique character, and I still remember fact-checking his investigative piece on the US government's antitrust case against IBM. There must have been hundreds of facts in the piece, names, dates, times, and at the end, I had missed one thing, the hour at which the judge handed down the decision. And I can still remember Steve yelling at me in exasperation that when it came to facts, 99% was not enough. And it's something that I think about every working day of my life. He is also the person who said, you can judge a publication by its corrections policy, and if it doesn't admit mistakes, you can't trust it. It was good advice. I want to thank, too, someone else who's not here, but who was very important, and that's Simon Lee, who was then the editor of the foreign editor of the Los Angeles Times, and took a chance on sending me overseas. And Susan Shura, at the time the foreign editor of the New York Times, who hired me and encouraged me to think analytically as well as empathetically. And thank you, too, to Joe Kahn and Michael Slackman, who have allowed me to continue my foreign reporting, both at the New York Times. There's one more person that I wish were here tonight, and that's John Carroll, the Los Angeles Times former executive editor, a man who was fearless about criticizing the government and knew from his personal experience of covering Vietnam about the government's capacity for lying, but managed to be at once a skeptic and a humanist. He died earlier this year at barely 74, which was much too soon. I want to pause here also to thank a couple of colleagues without whom I might not be here today and be working again. Rod Nordlund, who writes a lead better than anyone else I know and is an amazing colleague. And Adam Ferguson, an Australian photographer. Both of them were there for me when the helicopter crashed on Mount Sinjar. And it was Adam, who was then on assignment for the New York Times, who, along with a Kurdish Peshmerga, pulled me from the rubble and kept me from losing consciousness by talking to me. It was Rod who not only ensured that I was evacuated from Mount Sinjar, he was meeting with a top Kurdish official at the time he got the news and pleaded for him to make sure I got on one of the first helicopters to bring people down. But he then drove through the night in Kurdistan, which was under siege by ISIS, if you recall, which was hardly a safe journey, to reach me at a military hospital in northern Iraq. And Rod and Joe Kahn on the phone then dealt with a truly jaw-droppingly ill-informed insurance company, which actually proposed initially, as I understand it, evacuating me through a well-known international airport in Mosul, utterly unaware that the place had been under ISIS control for more than 2 months, which was a sobering reminder that people don't read that much of what we write. When I came to consciousness, Joe Kahn, who had many more important things to do, was in my hospital room in Istanbul. He's the foreign editor of the New York Times. He had lots of other places in the world to worry about. But what he had done was to bring with him the most important thing in the world to me, a new iPhone and an iPad. An enormous vote of confidence and a signal that as far as the paper was concerned, I was still a reporter. It's something I'll never forget. I'm going to finish soon and not delay the rest of people's evening, but I want to say a little bit about covering war and express my enormous gratefulness to my editors at the New York Times for their commitment to the coverage, and make a plea to other editors, anyone who is here, to keep investing in both foreign reporting and especially conflict coverage. The two questions I get asked most often are, don't you get scared, and don't you get tired of writing about war? And the answer is, of course I get scared, and I never get tired of it. Why? Covering war is like covering life. It's a vast canvas, just one that includes guns and explosives. War is sadly part of the human condition. It will not be over during our lifetime, but it is much more than a story of battles and bombs. It is a story of what happens to a country or a people when they are caught in an armed conflict. It is about why they take different sides, and it is a story of civilian lives ruined, of cultural treasures smashed or forgotten, as well as a story of geopolitics that care very little for either the culture or the people. It is a story of refugees, as we've seen this year, and of courageous or impoverished people who cannot or choose not to leave. So it is a rich and compelling drama with something for every reader and certainly for every writer. But more than that, these recent events in Syria and Iraq, in Afghanistan, and most recently in my home city of Paris, have at least some of their roots in US policy decisions. Unless journalists are there to raise questions and to bear witness to what is happening on the ground, we will be relying exclusively on the accounts of the American military and Western diplomats to tell us what is going on. And that will not be the whole story. Often it will not be a true story at all. It is expensive. It is expensive for journalistic organizations to cover wars. It is complicated to staff. It requires constant readjustment and enormous worry for all of the editors involved, since staff members can be injured, some can even die. But if we do not try to tell the story in all the voices of those living in it, and from as close to the ground as we possibly can, we have really failed in our duty in the public trust. Nothing means more to me than when someone says, "I learned a lot reading your article," or "You made me want to understand more about that." This is the heart of our work. Thank you so very much.